The 13th of February 2018 was a beautiful day in San Francisco on the west coast of the United States. The visibility was well over 10 miles, hardly any clouds and only light winds, a perfect day for flying. This was exactly what Captain Christopher Behnam thought as he headed out towards San Francisco Airport that morning. He was a tall, distinguished 57-year-old captain with proud Iranian heritage who had dreamed about becoming an airline pilot since he was a little boy. Through hard work and dedication, he had achieved this goal and worked his way up through United Airlines. At the time of this flight, Captain Behnam had amassed just over 13,600 hours of total time. During his career, he had flown almost all of the large Boeings including the 737, 747, 757, 767 and now the Boeing 777, which he was reasonably new on with only 360 hours. He was in a particularly good mood this morning since he was flying over to Honolulu, Hawaii. One of his absolute favorite destinations and a route he'd flown countless times. As he entered the crew room, he met his colleague, First Officer Paul Ayres, whom he'd never flown with before. Paul was 60 years old and also very experienced. He had just over 11,300 hours in total, of which around 10,000 had been flown on the 777. However, this would only be his second flight from San Francisco to Honolulu since he was normally based in Washington, D.C. The two pilots found it easy to talk to each other and soon started looking through their pre-flight briefing material. The weather looked great for the entire flight with only some cloudy weather expected over Honolulu, but everything was well within planning requirements. They completed their pre-flight check and ordered fuel. They walked over to the cabin crew to brief them about the flight. The flight time was expected to be around 4 hours and 40 minutes with only occasional turbulence and 364 passengers planned. Once everyone had asked their questions and were ready, the whole crew walked together out to the gate where their shiny 777 was waiting. It was an amazing-looking machine which had been bought new by United 23 years earlier and was now basking in the sunlight with catering and fueling going on around it. The Boeing 777 is an absolutely amazing aircraft with one standout feature. If you've ever had the chance to look at a Boeing 777 up close, there's one thing that will stand out: its two gigantic engines. These engines play a central role in this story. The Pratt & Whitney 4077 engines have a fan diameter of 112 inches or 2.8 meters, meaning the outer diameter of the fan cowling is almost as wide as the body of a Boeing 737. These enormous engines are a big reason why the airliner has become so popular, because generally, the larger the engine fan diameter, the more efficient the whole engine becomes. What drives an aircraft forward is essentially the reaction force created by sucking air in through the front of the engines and then accelerating it backwards. To increase that force, we either accelerate the same amount of air a lot or accelerate a larger amount of air a little bit. As jet engine technology has matured, it's become clear that the second option is far more fuel efficient. That's why we see bigger and bigger engines being created. The bigger fans increase the bypass ratio, meaning more air flows past the engine core and increases the total air mass accelerated. But making engines bigger also has drawbacks. As engines get bigger, so do all the involved components, which means significantly higher weight. At a certain point, that weight increase outweighs the performance increase from the bigger fan, meaning the engine has reached its maximum size. To counteract this, engine manufacturers constantly work on new designs that allow components to become lighter and enable engines to become even bigger. In the case of the PW4000 series engines, one strategy was to hollow out the titanium alloy fan blades, creating empty chambers inside them to substantially reduce weight. But making engines bigger also has drawbacks. As engines get bigger, so do all the involved components, which means significantly higher weight. At a certain point, that weight increase outweighs the performance increase from the bigger fan, meaning the engine has reached its maximum size. To counteract this, engine manufacturers constantly work on new designs that allow components to become lighter and enable engines to become even bigger. In the case of the PW4000 series engines, one strategy was to hollow out the titanium alloy fan blades, creating empty chambers inside them to substantially reduce weight. The new solution was called thermal acoustic imaging, or TI. It worked by using sound energy to create vibrations inside the fan blade material. If there was a crack present, the surfaces inside that crack would start rubbing against each other, creating a heat signal which could be detected using a thermal sensor. This was a brilliant idea and relatively simple compared to other techniques, so Pratt and Whitney quickly rolled it out widely. After that, only if there was a positive indication on TAI would the blade be sent for further non-destructive testing using other technologies. Since TI was considered a new and emerging technology, there initially were no defined training and certification regimen for the inspectors who would use it, and there were many fan blades that needed inspection. The blades fitted to the aircraft in this story had gone through TI inspections in both 2010 and 2015. The inspectors had noticed something looking odd on one of the blades but had written it off as an issue with the overlaying paint layer. You might ask, what's the point of this check if discrepancies are written off without further investigation? That's a valid point. It becomes clearer when you consider the lack of training mentioned earlier. On similar inspections using other technologies, the required minimum training was 40 classroom hours followed by 1,200 hours of practical training. But the inspectors handling these involved fan blades had only received 40 hours of practical training total. There had been more training offered, but unfortunately the involved inspector couldn't attend because he was working through a huge inspection backlog. Other factors included inspections taking place in a room where sunshine regularly came in, creating ghost images on thermal scans and making evaluations harder to interpret. Together, all these factors had allowed fan blade number 11 on the number 2 engine to develop a tiny crack inside the hollow space near the root of the blade. This crack was completely impossible to see with the naked eye but kept growing bigger with each cycle the engine operated. When the pilots had left their bags in the cockpit, the captain looked through the technical logbook and saw the aircraft was completely clean with no recent technical issues logged. It was time to start the pre-flight inspection, which at United Airlines is always done by the first officer. Together, all these factors had allowed fan blade number 11 on the number 2 engine to develop a tiny crack inside the hollow space near the root of the blade. This crack was completely impossible to see with the naked eye but kept growing bigger with each cycle the engine operated. When the pilots had left their bags in the cockpit, the captain looked through the technical logbook and saw the aircraft was completely clean with no recent technical issues logged. It was time to start the pre-flight inspection, which at United Airlines is always done by the first officer. As the pilots arrived at the aircraft, they were met by another colleague, First Officer Ed Gagarin, who wanted to ask if he could hitch a ride back to Honolulu. He had just finished an earlier shift and was eager to get back home for his rest days. He had seen the flight was almost fully booked and asked if there was any chance he could join the pilots in the cockpit. Captain Betnam greeted him happily and joked that if he was going to sit up front, he might also have to do some work. They both laughed, not knowing how true this would turn out to be. Ed mentioned he had just completed his line training, a fact that would soon play a very important role in the story. While First Officer Paul was doing his walk-around, Captain Betnam continued setting up the aircraft for departure. When Paul returned to the cockpit, they could immediately start briefing and preparing for departure. Captain Betnam asked if Paul had any preferences on who should act as pilot flying for the leg. Paul answered he would love to do that since he wanted experience on this route. Soon the lead purser advised them all passengers had been boarded and the crew was ready. There were now 363 passengers and 15 crew members on board the aircraft. The pilots completed their last few checklists and their briefing for departure from runway 28 left. Soon after, First Officer Paul requested pushback from stand 80. They started their engines and taxied out towards the runway holding point. All checks were completed normally with no anomalies noted. At 9:38 Pacific Standard Time, after a grueling 38-minute taxi, First Officer Paul finally moved the thrust levers forward for takeoff, and the giant Boeing 777 started accelerating down the runway. The takeoff and initial climb were completely uneventful. Once the gear and flaps were retracted, the flight soon received clearance to join their oceanic route towards Honolulu, one of the longest uninterrupted overwater routes in the world. Other routes are longer but have alternate airports on islands along the way, while the stretch between San Francisco and Honolulu is just over water. The aircraft climbed in steps up to its final cruise altitude of flight level 380 or 38,000 feet. Once there, the crew started completing paperwork and chatted about their previous experience and plans for the week ahead. The first 3.5 hours continued in the same standard way. They had only position reports, fuel checks, and ACARS messages sent regarding weather and wind. Captain Betnam chuckled about the fact that he had flown to Honolulu countless times in his career but had never seen a solid covering cloud layer stretching from 2,000 to 33,000 feet over the islands as they were now planning to see. Soon they entered an area of light to moderate turbulence and asked Honolulu Control if they could descend 2,000 feet down to flight level 360 to try to get out of it. This was approved, and First Officer Paul dialed it in on the mode control panel. He let the autopilot initiate a cruise descent the same way he had done thousands of times before. They were now about 200 nautical miles northeast of Honolulu with around 40 minutes of flight remaining when the crack in the number 11 fan blade reached a point of no return. Within a millisecond, the giant fan blade separated in a clean cut about 3.5 centimeters above its root. It shot outwards with incredible force and almost immediately impacted the adjoining blade, which also shattered and went inwards into the engine core, raising even more havoc there. The number 11 fan blades started moving forward inside the protective barrel. When it hit the edges, it created multiple high-energy shock waves which ultimately exceeded the certified specifications of the forward inner barrel and the cowling. This meant those parts soon failed and were immediately ripped off the engine. This is known as a fan blade out or FBO event, something engines are tested to sustain during certification. The protective barrel directly surrounding the blades is constructed from incredibly durable Kevlar, but the forward barrel and aerodynamic engine cowling is not. Parts of the engine inlet used during certification testing had been made from aluminum. The aluminum had greater ability to yield and deform than the carbon fiber reinforced polymer used in production. This was found to be one reason for the quick destruction of the forward parts while the Kevlar casing stayed reasonably intact. But when those forward sections disappeared, parts of the fan blades still spiraling forward managed to escape the encasement and shot straight into the side of the aircraft. Through incredible luck, they impacted the body exactly where a stringer, a structural part of the body, was located just below a passenger window. This meant the blade fragment didn't puncture the cabin. This could have been catastrophic for the passenger sitting next to it, and even worse, would have caused immediate depressurization of the aircraft. Luckily, that didn't happen, but in the cockpit, none of the pilots had any idea what had just crippled their aircraft. They only heard an enormous explosion, and then it felt like the aircraft had literally hit a brick wall. The deceleration was so severe that Captain Betnam and First Officer Ayres almost slammed their heads into their glare shield. Within 1.5 seconds, the aircraft had lurched into a 45-degree right bank while also yawing sharply in the same direction. This was incredibly disorienting as it all happened very fast and literally came from nowhere with no prior warning. 1 second they were flying along nicely, and the next, their aircraft was literally snap-rolling over its right wing and shaking like it was about to break up. Captain Betnam, being the training captain he was, immediately realized the gravity of the situation and called out, "I have controls." He grabbed the control wheel as the autopilot and autothrottle both disengaged, then glanced down at his engine displays to confirm what he thought must be a catastrophic engine failure. When he looked at the displays, he saw to his amazement that the engine instruments both showed completely normal values. So he called out, "What happened?" to get help identifying the failure. First Officer Paul Ayres just responded, "I don't know. The engine instruments are normal." In the corner of his eye, Captain Betnam now saw how the airspeed, which just seconds ago had been steadily at Mach 0.83, had started slowing down rapidly. He knew he had very little time to react. Whatever this was, it was coming from the right side as the aircraft was both yawing and rolling that way. He instinctively pushed left rudder and gently gave maximum ailerons towards the left. All he could think about was trying to keep the blue side up on his primary flight display while also pushing the left thrust lever all the way forward to get as much thrust as possible to slow the deceleration. At this altitude, it's very important not to move the controls too fast as that can cause Mach shock waves to form. The fact that the aircraft was already banking 45 degrees meant they were experiencing higher than normal g-forces, which also increases the aircraft's stall speed. Ed, the first officer on the jump seat, now called out, "Maybe we've had an in-flight collision." That would definitely explain the explosion, extreme vibrations, and sudden loss of control they were experiencing, but they were at 36,000 feet and had seen nothing on their TAS. There just shouldn't be anyone else at that altitude. Above 18,000 feet in the U.S., all airspace is controlled with mandatory transponder use, so if there had been anyone else up there, they should have seen it. With full deflection on both rudder and aileron, the stricken 777 now started slowly rolling back towards wings level. But the airspeed was still decreasing. All of this, except for the strange engine indications, were typical for a severe engine failure, and Captain Behnam knew that if this was the case, the aircraft would not be able to maintain its altitude much longer. A twin-engine jet can, depending on type and weight, normally keep an altitude around 21,000 to 24,000 feet on one engine, but never 36,000. This meant he needed to start descending immediately, otherwise the aircraft would soon stall and he could potentially completely lose control. They were now shaking so badly that the pilots had problems focusing their eyes. They had difficulty seeing their instruments in front of them and reaching for specific controls. Meanwhile, a sickening sound of twisting metal could be heard from behind them, a sound similar to what you would hear in a sinking submarine as pressure starts crushing it. 35 seconds after the start of this nightmare, the engine instruments for the right-hand engine suddenly started blanking one by one. What had actually happened was that the entire EEC, a computer in charge of reporting values to the engine instruments, had been ripped away when the engine cowling separated. What the pilots had been looking at was just the last reported values from the engine before the failure occurred, which had stuck in the screen's memory due to lack of other inputs. This finally confirmed to the crew that they were dealing with some kind of severe damage to the right-hand engine. Captain Behnam therefore asked First Officer Paul to please start executing the engine severe damage checklist from the ECL, their electronic checklist. In other aircraft, like the Boeing 737, this type of failure includes memory items that must be done from memory without reference to a checklist. But in the 777, this had to be done from their internal electronic checklist in their ICAs. The problem now was that the aircraft was shaking so badly that the first officer simply couldn't reach to use the ICAs at all. This is where experience comes in. Both pilots had been operating with memory items in previous aircraft, which meant they could go through them from memory. Paul started reading out autothrottle, confirm off. Off. Engine thrust lever, confirm close. Close. Engine start lever, confirm cut off. Cut off. All three pilots made sure they didn't rush these steps because previous accidents had taught them it's easy to misidentify a failure and shut down the wrong engine.